The bride's family immediately decided he didn't belong at their upscale wedding. They had no idea that the out-of-place guest, quietly observing from the back, was actually the owner of the $2 million venue they were celebrating in. What happened next would turn their perfect day into a lesson about respect they'd never forget. The afternoon sun streamed through the crystal chandeliers of Riverside Manor as Marine Corps veteran David Chen adjusted his modest blue tie one final time before entering the grand ballroom. At 29, David looked younger than his years, despite the quiet weight he carried in his dark eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The kind of stillness that comes from seeing too much in places most people would never have to visit. His lean, compact build and careful movements revealed military bearing to those who knew what to look for, but in his off-the-rack charcoal suit from Men's Wearhouse, he looked like any other working-class wedding guest. What the elegantly dressed crowd couldn't see beneath that unremarkable exterior were the 3 Purple Hearts earned during 2 brutal tours in Fallujah and Ramadi, or the Bronze Star he'd received for single-handedly holding a checkpoint while his wounded squad members were evacuated under heavy fire. The scars from shrapnel and burns were hidden beneath his sleeves, but David carried them as reminders of brothers who hadn't made it home and promises he'd made in foxholes under mortar fire. 18 months ago, David had quietly purchased Riverside Manor using a combination of his military savings, VA benefits, and a substantial inheritance from his late grandfather Chen Meng. The old man had built a small construction empire from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan in 1960, teaching David that true wealth wasn't about showing off, it was about building something lasting while never forgetting where you came from. Money talks, but wealth whispers, his grandfather used to say in heavily accented English while reviewing blueprints at their kitchen table. The 2,000-year-old Georgian estate on the banks of the Connecticut River had been David's dream since he'd first seen it as a teenager, when his grandfather's crew had done restoration work on the property. The manor had sat abandoned for years, its potential hidden beneath peeling paint and broken windows. David saw what it could become, a place where families could celebrate life's most important moments, where history and beauty could serve happiness rather than gathering dust. He'd kept his ownership completely private, preferring to let his general manager, Patricia Williams, a former Marine herself, handle the day-to-day operations while he continued working his regular job as a construction supervisor for Coleman Brothers Construction in nearby Hartford. To most people, he was simply Dave from the crew, the quiet guy who never talked about his military service unless directly asked, who always remembered everyone's coffee order, and who somehow always knew exactly how to fix whatever was broken. David had deliberately maintained this low profile for good reasons. He'd grown tired of the way people changed around him when they learned about his military decorations or his financial success. Some became awkwardly deferential, others tried to use him for connections or money, and a few made assumptions about his politics or personality based on stereotypes. He preferred authentic relationships built on who he was as a person, not what he'd done or what he owned. Today's wedding held special significance that went far beyond business. The groom, Marcus Thompson, had been David's team leader and closest friend during their second deployment. The steady, unflappable sergeant, who dragged David's unconscious body 300 yards through enemy fire after an IED had nearly ended his life. Marcus had spent 48 hours by David's hospital bed in Germany, talking him through the worst pain and darkest moments of his recovery. When Marcus had called 6 months ago asking about booking Riverside Manor for his wedding to Amanda, David had felt his heart swell with genuine happiness. He'd secretly arranged for Marcus to receive their military family discount, a 50% reduction that David had never advertised but offered quietly to any veteran who needed it. Marcus had no idea that his old battle buddy owned the venue. He thought he'd just gotten lucky with a sympathetic manager who appreciated his service. David approached the manor's ornate entrance carrying a small gift wrapped in simple brown paper, no fancy ribbons or designer wrapping. Inside was Marcus's original dog tag from their deployment, the one David had recovered from the blast site and kept safe through months of recovery and rehabilitation. He'd promised to return it on Marcus's wedding day, a symbol of their brotherhood surviving everything the war had thrown at them. The manor's entire staff had been briefed to treat David like any other guest today. Patricia knew to handle any issues without consulting him, and the servers were instructed to offer him the same polite service they'd give to any friend of the groom. David wanted nothing more than to blend into the background, enjoy watching his friend marry the woman who'd waited for him through 2 deployments, and maybe share a quiet beer while swapping stories about their new civilian life. As he straightened his shoulders and walked toward the entrance, David felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. The manor looked perfect. Patricia had outdone herself with the decorations. The catering staff was already setting up for the reception, and everything was running smoothly. His grandfather would have been proud to see the old estate restored to its former glory, filled with love and celebration instead of silence and decay. David had no idea that his decision to remain anonymous was about to collide with some people's ugliest assumptions about who deserved to be in their exclusive world. David stepped through the manor's mahogany double doors and immediately felt the familiar sense of pride that came with seeing his vision fully realized. The grand foyer sparkled under the light of the restored Waterford crystal chandelier, its facets casting rainbow patterns across the freshly polished marble floors that his crew had spent weeks restoring by hand. The smell of fresh flowers, white roses and baby's breath arranged by Hartford's most exclusive florist, mixed with the faint scent of lemon oil from the antique furniture he'd personally selected at estate sales throughout New England. But today wasn't about admiring his business success. David was here for one reason: to celebrate Marcus Thompson, the man who'd saved his life and taught him what brotherhood really meant. After 2 years of physical therapy and emotional healing, David had promised himself that when Marcus got married, he'd be there not as a venue owner or successful businessman, but simply as the grateful friend who owed his life to the groom's courage under fire. David checked his watch. 2:15 p.m. The ceremony was scheduled for 3:30, which gave him time to find Marcus and surprise him with the dog tag before the pre-wedding chaos reached its peak. He'd deliberately arrived early to avoid the crowd of Amanda's family and friends, most of whom he'd never met. Marcus had mentioned that Amanda came from old Connecticut money, her father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, and her mother was involved in charity galas and country club committees. David felt no intimidation about their wealth, but he preferred to avoid the social maneuvering that often came with such circles. The reception area buzzed with activity as Patricia's team made final preparation. David watched with quiet satisfaction as servers arranged champagne flutes with military precision, and the catering staff from Chez Laurent, Hartford's most prestigious restaurant, set up their elaborate buffet station. Every detail had been planned to perfection. The string quartet was already practicing in the corner, their music floating gently through the air, and the photographer was testing lighting angles near the grand staircase where the couple would make their entry. David's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Can't believe this is really happening, brother. Amanda's family is intense, but they're good people. Can't wait to see you, assuming you can take time off from building half of Hartford." Smiling, David typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Got something special for you." As he made his way toward the groom's preparation room, David passed groups of early arriving guests. The contrast between the two families was immediately apparent. Marcus's side consisted mainly of veterans, construction workers, teachers, and first responders, people who worked with their hands and carried themselves with unpretentious confidence. They wore their best suits and dresses, clearly making an effort to look nice for their friend's special day, but their clothing told the story of men and women who valued function over fashion. Amanda's family and friends, however, moved through the space like they owned it. The women wore designer dresses that probably cost more than David's monthly construction crew payroll, accompanied by jewelry that caught the light with every gesture. The men sported custom suits and Swiss watches, their confident laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. They examined the manor's details, with the casual appreciation of people accustomed to luxury, pointing out architectural features and commenting on the quality of the restoration work. "Gorgeous venue," David heard one woman say to her companion as they admired the hand-carved crown molding. Amanda said, "They got an amazing deal on it. Some veteran-owned place that gives military discounts. Smart of Marcus to play that angle. David paused, feeling a slight sting at hearing his military service reduced to an angle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But he pushed the feeling aside. Today was about Marcus and Amanda's happiness, not his ego. He continued toward the groom's room, passing the bride's preparation area where he could hear excited female voices discussing last-minute details. Through the partially open door, he glimpsed Amanda in her stunning white gown, surrounded by bridesmaids in dusty blue dresses that perfectly complemented the manor's color scheme. She looked radiant and genuinely happy, which made David smile. Marcus had chosen well. The hallway leading to the groom's room was lined with photographs David had commissioned of the manor's history. Images spanning 2 centuries of celebrations, from Civil War-era gatherings to 19. His grandfather had taught him that understanding a building's past was essential to honoring its future, and David had spent countless hours researching the families who'd called Riverside Manor home. As he approached Marcus's door, David could hear the familiar sound of military buddies giving each other grief. Good-natured ribbing mixed with genuine affection. These were his people, men who'd shared foxholes and MREs, who'd seen each other at their worst and still chose to stand together. In this room, David wouldn't have to explain his scars or justify his choices. Here he was simply Dave, Marcus's battle buddy who'd made it home. David knocked gently, and heard Marcus's voice boom through the door. "If that's another photographer, I'm jumping out the window." "It's just your favorite construction worker," David called back, grinning as he heard chairs scraping and excited voices, recognizing his voice. The door flew open to reveal Marcus in his dress blue uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of their shared service. Behind him stood 4 other Marines, all grinning at David like he was a long-lost brother returning home. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus said, his face breaking into the same wide smile David remembered from their deployment. "Look what the cat dragged in." David felt his heart lift as he stepped into the room, surrounded by the brotherhood that had sustained him through his darkest moments. For now, the outside world and all its complications could wait. This was where he belonged, not because of what he owned or what he'd accomplished, but because of the bonds forged in fire and brotherhood that no amount of money could buy. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of masculine camaraderie, as David caught up with Marcus and his groomsmen in the preparation room. The space, originally the manor's library, still retained its rich mahogany paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes that David had carefully preserved during the restoration. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, overlooking the Connecticut River, where a few sailboats drifted lazily in the afternoon breeze. "Man, I still can't believe you own a construction company now," said Tommy Rodriguez, Marcus's best man and their former squad mate. "Remember when you used to complain about having to dig foxholes?" David laughed, loosening his tie slightly, as he settled into the comfortable rhythm of military banter. "Different kind of digging, brother. These days I build things up instead of trying not to get blown up while digging them." The presentation of Marcus's dog tag had been everything David had hoped for. His friend's eyes had actually misted over as he held the piece of metal that had traveled with them through Ramadi's most dangerous neighborhood. "I thought this was gone forever," Marcus had whispered, clasping David's shoulder with the grip of a man who understood the weight of what he'd been given. Now, as the ceremony time approached, David made his way back toward the main areas of the manor to find his seat. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a busy preparation zone was now an elegant wedding venue that rivaled anything in New York or Boston. Patricia and her team had worked their usual magic, turning the grand ballroom into something from a fairy tale. The ceremony space took David's breath away, even though he'd seen it dozens of times during other events. 200 white Chiavari chairs were arranged in perfect rows, facing a flower-draped altar, positioned beneath the ballroom's most stunning feature, a massive stained glass window depicting the 4 seasons that cast colored light across the polished marble floor. The window had been the manor's original owner's pride and joy in 1823, and David had spent nearly 6 months finding artisans skilled enough to restore it to its former glory. White roses and baby's breath cascaded from tall arrangements flanking the altar, their fragrance mixing with the subtle scent of beeswax candles that flickered in hurricane glass holders along the aisle. The manor's original crystal chandeliers had been dimmed to create intimate lighting that made the entire space feel warm and romantic. A harpist in the corner played soft classical music that echoed beautifully off the vaulted ceiling. David found himself taking mental notes on the event's execution, a habit he couldn't shake even when he was supposed to be just a guest. The acoustics were perfect. The harpist could be heard clearly but wasn't overwhelming conversation. The temperature was comfortable despite the September warmth outside, thanks to the upgraded HVAC system he'd installed last year. The sight lines from every seat to the altar were unobstructed, exactly as he'd planned when designing the seating layout. Guests were beginning to fill the chairs now, and the contrast between the two families became even more apparent in the formal wedding setting. Marcus's side arrived in small groups, the men checking their ties nervously, and the women smoothing their dresses with the self-consciousness of people wearing their very best clothes. They moved with respect through the elegant space, clearly impressed but not overwhelmed. These were people who appreciated quality craftsmanship when they saw it. David recognized several faces from their military days: Staff Sergeant William, who'd taught them all how to survive their first month in country, Corporal Jackson, who'd been their radio operator and comedian, and Lieutenant Morrison, their former platoon leader who'd driven down from Boston for the occasion. They wore their dress uniforms with pride, their ribbons and decorations telling silent stories of service and sacrifice. Amanda's side of the aisle filled differently. Her guests arrived with the confident ease of people accustomed to luxury venues, their designer clothing and expensive accessories creating a visual symphony of wealth and status. They examined the manor's features with the casual appreciation of connoisseurs, nodding approvingly at the restoration work while discussing other high-end venues they'd experienced. "The flowers are stunning," David heard one woman say to her companion as they took their seats in the front row. "Amanda's mother really outdid herself with the arrangements, though I heard they had to compromise on some things because of the military discount situation." "Well, the venue is gorgeous regardless," her friend replied, adjusting her pearl necklace. "I looked it up online. Normally this place charges premium rates." Amanda was smart to leverage Marcus's service for a better deal. David felt a familiar tightness in his chest at hearing his military service described as leverage, but he pushed the feeling down. These people didn't understand what service meant, and he wasn't here to educate them. He was here for Mark. The manor's grandfather clock chimed 3:15 as David made his way to his assigned seat, 7th row back on the groom's side, perfectly positioned to see everything without drawing attention to himself. Around him, Marcus's military friends were engaged in quiet conversations, their voices carrying the easy familiarity of men who'd shared dangerous experiences together. The atmosphere in the ballroom was charged with anticipation and joy. Children from both families fidgeted in their seats while parents reminded them to sit still. Elderly relatives dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, already emotional before the ceremony had even begun. The photographer moved discreetly around the edges of the space, capturing candid moments of guests arriving and settling in. David pulled out his phone to silence it, and noticed a text from Patricia: "Everything running smoothly, kitchen reports on schedule, string quartet ready for processional. You can just enjoy being a guest today." He smiled and slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. This was exactly what he'd envisioned when he'd bought the manor, a place where life's most important moments could unfold with dignity and beauty, where families could create memories that would last generations. As the harpist finished her piece, and the string quartet began to take their positions for the processional, David settled back in his chair with genuine contentment. The manor looked perfect. His friend was about to marry the woman he loved, and everything was proceeding exactly as planned. He had no idea that some of the elegantly dressed guests around him were already forming opinions about who belonged in their exclusive celebration, and that his modest appearance had placed him squarely in the category of people they considered beneath their notice. At exactly 3:30 p.m., the string quartet began the opening notes of Pachelbel's canon in D, and David felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. There was something about weddings that always got to him. Maybe it was the hope they represented, or the reminder of promises made and kept. As the bridesmaids began their processional down the aisle in flowing dusty blue gowns, David found himself thinking about the friends who hadn't made it home to have their own wedding days. He pulled out his phone discreetly to capture a short video for the guys who couldn't be here. Rodriguez had asked him to record Marcus's reaction when he first saw Amanda. David held the phone low, trying not to disturb other guests while focusing on Marcus, who stood at the altar in his dress blues looking nervous, but radiant. The moment Amanda appeared at the back of the ballroom, David forgot about everything else. She was absolutely stunning in her flowing white gown, her veil trailing behind her as she walked arm in arm with her father down the aisle lined with rose petals. The stained glass window cast colored light across her dress, creating an almost ethereal effect that made the entire scene look like something from a fairy tale. David watched Marcus's face transform as he saw his bride, the nervous energy melting into pure joy and wonder. This was what David had envisioned when he'd restored the manor, moments of perfect happiness framed by beauty and history. He quickly captured Marcus's expression on video, knowing Rodriguez would want to see their tough-as-nails sergeant getting emotional at his own wedding. As Amanda reached the altar and her father lifted her veil for the traditional kiss, David felt genuinely happy for his friend. Marcus had been through hell during their deployment. They all had, but he'd never lost his fundamental optimism about life and love. Watching him take Amanda's hands while the officiant began the ceremony, David felt grateful to witness this moment of pure joy after so much darkness. The ceremony proceeded beautifully, with personal vows that brought tears to eyes throughout the ballroom. When Marcus spoke about Amanda waiting for him through 2 deployments, and believing in their love even when he couldn't believe in himself, David had to blink back his own emotions. These were the moments that made everything, the war, the injuries, the long recovery, feel worth it. During the ring exchange, David noticed Amanda's mother, an elegantly dressed woman with perfectly styled silver hair and diamond earrings that caught the light, leaning over to whisper something to the woman beside her. Both women glanced in his direction before returning their attention to the ceremony. David felt a small flicker of self-consciousness, but dismissed it. People often looked around during weddings, and he was probably just imagining things. When the officiant pronounced Marcus and Amanda husband and wife, the entire ballroom erupted in cheers and applause. David found himself whistling and clapping enthusiastically, his voice joining the military contingent's celebration of their brother's happiness. The string quartet struck up the recessional music as the new couple walked back down the aisle, Marcus's grin so wide it threatened to split his face in half. As guests began filing out for the cocktail hour, David pulled out his phone to text Rodriguez. Mission accomplished. Got the perfect reaction shot. Our boy is officially off the market and couldn't be happier. The response came immediately. You're killing me, man. Send that video ace. Tell Marcus I said he owes me $20. I bet him Amanda would cry before he did. David chuckled as he stood up, straightening his suit jacket and checking that his tie was still properly adjusted. The cocktail hour was being held in the manor's conservatory and adjacent gardens, where Patricia had arranged for past hors d'oeuvres and an open bar. David was looking forward to getting a beer and congratulating Marcus and Amanda before the reception dinner began. As he made his way toward the conservatory, David passed groups of Amanda's family members gathered in the foyer, their voices carrying in the acoustic space. He overheard fragments of conversation about the ceremony, the venue and their plans for the evening. Most of it was typical wedding chatter, but one exchange made him pause near a marble pillar. The ceremony was lovely, but I'm surprised they didn't splurge more on the guest list, a woman was saying to her companion. I mean, some of those military friends, they seemed sweet enough, but you could tell they weren't exactly used to this level of elegance. Well, Marcus comes from a different background, her friend replied diplomatically. Amanda knew what she was getting into, though I have to say, some of his friends looked a bit out of place. That Asian fellow in the cheap suit kept taking pictures with his phone during the ceremony. David felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized they were talking about him. He'd been discreet with the video, or so he thought. More concerning was the casual way they'd dismissed him and Marcus's other friends, as somehow unworthy of the elegant surroundings that David had personally restored and designed. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that these people didn't know who he was, and their opinions shouldn't matter. He was here for Marcus, not to win approval from social snobs. Still, the comments stung more than he wanted to admit. After everything he'd been through, everything he'd accomplished, being reduced to that Asian fellow in the cheap suit felt like a slap in the face. David straightened his shoulders and continued toward the conservatory, determined not to let small-minded people ruin his friend's wedding day. He had a beer to drink, a friend to congratulate, and a celebration to enjoy. Whatever these people thought about him was their problem, not. But as he walked through the doors into the cocktail reception, David couldn't shake the feeling that the comments he'd overheard were just the beginning of a longer, more uncomfortable evening. The conservatory buzzed with elegant conversation as cocktail hour reached its peak. David nursed a cold Stella Artois while admiring how perfectly Patricia had executed the reception setup. The glass-walled space overlooked the manor's formal gardens, where late afternoon sunlight filtered through ancient oak trees and cast dancing shadows across the manicured lawn. Small round tables draped in cream linens held arrangements of white hydrangeas and eucalyptus, while servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of canapés and champagne flutes. David had found a comfortable spot near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, close enough to the action to feel included but far enough from the main crowd to observe without drawing attention. He'd already congratulated Marcus and Amanda, sharing a brief but meaningful moment with his friend, where Marcus had gripped his shoulder and said, "Thanks for being here, brother. It means everything." The newlyweds were now making their rounds through the crowd, Amanda's hand resting on Marcus's arm as they graciously accepted congratulations from both families. David watched with genuine pleasure as Marcus introduced his bride to his military friends, noting how Amanda seemed genuinely interested in their stories and comfortable with their more casual manner of speaking. But as the couple moved toward Amanda's side of the gathering, David began to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The elegant cluster of Amanda's family and friends near the garden doors seemed to have formed their own exclusive circle, their voices carrying with the confidence of people accustomed to being the center of attention wherever they went. "Darling, the ceremony was absolutely perfect," David heard Amanda's mother, Vivian Blackwood, say to a woman David recognized as Amanda's aunt, "though I must say, some of the groom's guests are quite colorful." Vivian Blackwood was a woman who commanded attention without trying. Silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, a navy blue designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the kind of subtle but expensive jewelry that whispered rather than shouted well. Her voice carried the polished accent of someone who'd attended the best schools and moved in the highest social circles for decades. "Well, military men do tend to be a bit rough around the edges," her companion replied diplomatically, "but Marcus seems like a lovely boy, very devoted to Amanda." David found himself unconsciously moving closer to their conversation, something about their tone triggering the same instincts that had kept him alive in hostile territory. These weren't just casual observations, there was an undercurrent of judgment that made his military-trained senses sharpen. "Oh, Marcus is wonderful," Vivian continued, "but some of his friends, I mean, I appreciate their service, of course, but there's a difference between appreciating from a distance and having them at your daughter's wedding." That man taking pictures during the ceremony with his phone was particularly inappropriate. David's jaw tightened as he realized they were talking about him again. He glanced around the conservatory, noting how the two groups had naturally segregated themselves. Marcus's military friends and family clustered around one section, while Amanda's relatives and friends dominated the prime spots near the garden entrance. "I noticed him too," added another voice, belonging to a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and an expensive suit. David recognized him as Amanda's uncle, Robert Blackwood, who owned several upscale restaurants in Hartford. Asian fellow, looked out of place in that off-the-rack suit. You can always tell when people aren't accustomed to proper events. The casual racism in the comment hit David like a physical blow. He'd faced prejudice before, both in the military and in civilian life, but it never stopped stinging. Here he was at a venue he owned, being dismissed not for his actions or character but for his appearance and ethnicity. Robert, please, Vivian said, though her tone suggested mild embarrassment rather than genuine disapproval. We should be grateful for their service. I just wish Amanda had managed the guest list a bit more carefully. David felt his hands clench involuntarily around his beer bottle. These people were discussing him and Marcus's other friends, like they were unwelcome intruders rather than invited guests celebrating their friend's happiness. The irony was almost overwhelming. They were standing in his property drinking his champagne, eating food prepared in his kitchen, while dismissing him as someone who didn't belong. A server approached the Blackwood group with a tray of champagne flutes, and David watched Robert Blackwood take 2 glasses without so much as acknowledging the young woman serving him. At least the venue is first-rate, Robert said to his wife. Amanda mentioned they got some sort of military discount, which was clever. Places like this usually charge premium rates. Yes, Patricia Williams, the manager, was quite accommodating about the pricing. Vivian agreed. Though between you and me, I think these veteran-owned businesses sometimes oversell their capabilities. The service has been adequate, but I've noticed a few rough edges. David's vision actually blurred for a moment with suppressed anger. Patricia Williams was one of the most professional event managers in New England, a former Marine who ran operations with military precision and attention to detail. The idea that these people would criticize her work while enjoying the flawless event she'd orchestrated was almost beyond his ability to process calmly. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself the way his combat stress counselor had taught him. These people didn't know who he was, and their ignorance was their problem, not his. He was here for Marcus, and he wouldn't let social snobs ruin his friend's wedding day. But as David tried to move away from the toxic conversation, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more unpleasant was building. The Blackwood family's sense of entitlement seemed to be growing with each glass of champagne, and their casual dismissal of the military guests was becoming more pointed and less diplomatic. Through the conservatory's windows, David could see Patricia coordinating with the catering staff in the garden, her movements efficient and professional as she ensured the transition to dinner service would be seamless. She caught his eye through the glass, and gave him a subtle thumbs up, completely unaware that the very people she was working so hard to please were criticizing her behind her back. David finished his beer and set the empty bottle on a nearby table, his jaw tight with controlled frustration. The beautiful afternoon celebration was beginning to feel like a minefield, and he had the sinking feeling that he was about to step on something explosive. The dinner bell chimed softly throughout the conservatory as Patricia's staff began directing guests toward the grand ballroom for the reception dinner. David watched the seamless transition with professional appreciation. Servers moved with choreographed precision, clearing cocktail glasses, while guests flowed naturally toward their assigned table. He checked his phone for the seating chart Patricia had sent him earlier. Table 12, positioned perfectly to see the head table where Marcus and Amanda would sit, but far enough from the Blackwood family's prime seating near the dance floor. As David made his way back into the ballroom, now transformed for dinner with elegant place settings and dramatic lighting, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The space looked absolutely magnificent. Crystal stemware caught the light from dimmed chandeliers. Gold-rimmed china plates sat precisely positioned at each place setting, and towering centerpieces of white roses and trailing ivy created an atmosphere of understated luxury. But his moment of quiet satisfaction was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Vivian Blackwood stood in the doorway, her voice carrying clearly across the space as she addressed Patricia, who was consulting her clipboard with the efficiency of someone managing a complex operation. "Excuse me," Vivian said, her tone carrying the particular sharpness of someone accustomed to immediate attention. "I need to discuss the seating arrangements. There seems to be some sort of..." Patricia looked up from her clipboard with the patient professionalism David had come to admire during their 18 months of working together. "Of course. Mrs. Blackwood, how can I help you?" "Well," Vivian began, gesturing toward the seating chart posted near the entrance, "I specifically requested that immediate family be seated in the premium locations near the dance floor. I understand this is a military discount venue, but surely you can accommodate basic social protocol." David felt his jaw clench at the casual dismissal embedded in Vivian's comment. The way she said, "military discount venue," made it sound like a budget motel rather than one of Connecticut's most prestigious event spaces. Patricia maintained her composure beautifully, her voice remaining steady and professional. Mrs. Blackwood, the seating chart was arranged according to the specifications provided by the bride and groom. If you'd like to make changes, I'd be happy to speak with Amanda about. I don't think that's necessary, Vivian interrupted, her voice rising slightly. Surely you can see that having Marcus's seated so prominently doesn't make sense for the photographs and the overall ambience of the evening. By now, other guests had begun to notice the conversation. David watched as several of Marcus's military friends paused in finding their seats, clearly aware that they were the subject of discussion. Staff Sergeant Williams, a man who'd earned 3 Bronze Stars and commanded respect wherever he went, looked uncomfortable as he realized the bride's mother was essentially arguing for his removal from prime seating. Robert Blackwood appeared at his sister-in-law's shoulder, adding his voice to the complaint. Patricia, is it? We've been very understanding about the eclectic guest list, but there are certain standards that need to be maintained. Some of Marcus's guests simply don't understand proper etiquette for events of this caliber. David found himself moving closer to the conversation, his military instincts fully engaged now. This wasn't just casual snobbery anymore. This was a coordinated effort to publicly embarrass and exclude the very people who'd bled alongside Marcus in combat zones. I understand your concerns, Patricia replied, her professionalism never wavering despite the obvious insult to her own military background. However, I'm not authorized to make seating changes without approval from. Look, Vivian said, lowering her voice but somehow making it more threatening. I don't know what kind of operations you're used to running, but this is a Blackwood family wedding. We've been hosting elegant events in Connecticut for 3 generations. I think we know a bit more about proper protocol than people from your background. The pause before your background landed like a slap. David watched Patricia's composure falter for just a moment, a slight tightening around her eyes that he recognized from their deployment days when someone crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. Miss Blackwood, Patricia said carefully, I'm a former Marine Corps logistics officer with 15 years of event management experience. I can assure you that every detail of this evening has been planned to the highest professional standards. Military experience, Robert interrupted with a dismissive laugh. Yes, well, that explains the functional approach, but this isn't a mess hall, dear. This is a sophisticated social event that requires a certain level of cultural understanding. David felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest as he watched 2 people who'd never served a day in their lives dismiss Patricia's military service and professional expertise. These weren't just ignorant comments anymore. This was deliberate humiliation of people who'd earned respect through sacrifice and service. Other guests were definitely watching now. Amanda looked mortified as she approached from the head table, clearly aware that her family was causing a scene. Marcus stood behind her, his face a carefully controlled mask that David recognized from their combat days, the expression of a man trying to decide whether to engage or maintain position. Mother, please, Amanda said quietly, Patricia has done an incredible job. Everything is perfect, Amanda darling, Vivian said, not taking her eyes off Patricia. You're too sweet for your own good. Sometimes someone needs to maintain standards when others won't. David found himself taking another step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his side. He could see the humiliation in Patricia's eyes, could sense the discomfort of the military guests who were realizing they were unwelcome in a space where they should have been honored. The Blackwoods had just crossed from casual prejudice into active hostility, and David could feel his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. These people were standing in his venue, insulting his manager, and treating his friends' fellow veterans like unwanted charity cases. As Vivian Blackwood opened her mouth to make another cutting remark, David realized that his decision to remain anonymous was about to collide with his inability to watch good people be degraded by entitled snobs who had no idea what they were about to unleash. As the confrontation with Patricia continued, David found himself studying the Blackwood family with the same tactical assessment skills he'd used to evaluate threats in Iraq. What he saw was a textbook example of entitled privilege backed by generations of unchallenged social dominance, and the complete lack of self-awareness that came with it. Vivian Blackwood stood at the center of the conflict like a general commanding troops, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dismissively as she continued her assault on Patricia's professionalism. Everything about her screamed old Connecticut money, from the subtle Cartier watch on her wrist, to the way she held her champagne flute like a scepter. David recognized the type from his construction work on wealthy estates, people who'd inherited their status and mistook accident of birth for personal achievement. "I really don't think you understand the caliber of event we're accustomed to," Vivian was saying to Patricia, her voice carrying the particular condescension of someone who'd never had to earn respect through merit. "The Blackwood family has been hosting society events in this state since before you were born. We know what works." Robert Blackwood nodded sagely beside his sister-in-law, his own sense of superiority radiating from every fiber of his custom-tailored suit. David had looked him up during the wedding planning. Robert owned 3 upscale restaurants in Hartford, but had inherited the money to start them from his father's insurance fortune. He was the kind of man who took credit for success built on inherited wealth while looking down on people who'd actually earned their achievements through blood and sacrifice. "Exactly," Robert added, swirling his cognac with the practiced motion of someone who considered himself a connoisseur. "Patricia, you seem like a nice enough girl, but there's a difference between military efficiency and social sophistication. Some things require a more refined." David watched as other Blackwood family members began to gather around Vivian and Robert, drawn by the spectacle like sharks sensing blood in the water. Amanda's cousin Chelsea, a woman in her 30s who'd never worked a day in her life but served on various charity boards, whispered something to her husband that made him chuckle. Amanda's brother Michael, fresh out of an Ivy League MBA program funded by family money, checked his expensive watch with the impatience of someone accustomed to getting his way immediately. These people moved as a pack, David realized. They'd spent their entire lives in an echo chamber where their opinions were validated by others exactly like them. They'd probably never encountered serious pushback on their prejudices because they surrounded themselves with people who either shared their views or were financially dependent on staying silent. "The problem," Vivian continued, her voice growing more animated as her audience expanded, "is that when you give discounts to certain populations, you end up compromising the overall quality of service. It's basic economics, really." David felt his fists clench as he watched Vivian reduce veterans to certain populations, as if military service was some kind of social disease rather than the highest form of civic duty. The casual dehumanization in her language revealed someone who'd never sacrificed anything for anyone beyond her immediate social circle. What made it worse was their absolute confidence in their righteousness. Robert straightened his tie and addressed Patricia with the patronizing smile of someone explaining basic facts to a child. "Look, we're not trying to be difficult. We simply have standards that need to be maintained. Some of Marcus's friends, well, they're fine people, I'm sure, but they don't really fit the aesthetic we're trying to achieve." "The aesthetic," Patricia repeated slowly, her professionalism beginning to show cracks around the edges. "Yes," Chelsea chimed in, emboldened by her elder's behavior. "I mean, look around. This is supposed to be an elegant affair, not a military reunion." David studied Chelsea's face as she spoke, noting the particular kind of ignorance that came from a life without consequences. She'd probably never met a veteran before tonight, had certainly never been in a situation where her safety depended on someone else's courage. The idea that military service somehow made people less worthy of respect was so foreign to her worldview that she stated it as simple fact. Michael checked his phone while his family continued their assault, clearly bored by the conversation but supportive of the outcome. "Mom's right," he said without looking up. "We paid good money for this venue even with the discount. We should get what we're paying for." The phrase "what we're paying for" hit David like a slap. These people saw the evening as a transaction where their money entitled them to treat other human beings as disposable props in their social theater. They had no concept that the very people they were dismissing had paid a price far greater than money they'd paid with their bodies, their mental health and in some cases their lives. Amanda stood nearby, her face pale with embarrassment, as she watched her family reveal their true character in front of her new husband and his friends. David felt genuinely sorry for her. She was clearly a decent person trapped between loyalty to her family and horror at their behavior. Marcus remained near the head table, his jaw tight with controlled anger. David could read his friend's expression like a book. Marcus was calculating whether to intervene and risk ruining his wedding or let the insults continue to protect Amanda's relationship with her family. It was an impossible position for any groom to be in, but what struck David most was the Blackwoods' complete certainty that they would prevail. They moved through the confrontation with the casual confidence of people who'd never encountered real consequences for their action. Vivian's voice never wavered, Robert's smile never faltered, and the supporting family members nodded along like this was all perfectly reasonable. They had no idea they were standing in a room owned by the very person they were attempting to humiliate. They couldn't conceive of a world where the quiet man in the cheap suit might have more power, more wealth and more moral authority than their entire family combined. David realized he was looking at people who'd built their entire identity on being superior to others, but had never actually been tested against real adversity. They were about to learn what happened when unearned arrogance met earned authority, and David was beginning to look forward to providing that education. "You know what, Patricia?" Vivian Blackwood said, her voice taking on the deadly sweet tone that wealthy women used when they were about to destroy someone socially. "I think we need to have a little chat about realistic expectations." David watched as Vivian stepped closer to Patricia, invading her personal space with the calculated aggression of someone who'd perfected the art of intimidation through social pressure. Around them, the elegant dinner service had ground to a halt as servers and guests alike became unwilling witnesses to what was rapidly becoming a public humiliation. "When the Blackwood family books a venue," Vivian continued, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "we expect a certain level of, shall we say, sophistication. Now I understand that military folk do their best with what they know, but this is a bit out of your league, don't you think?" Patricia's face had gone pale, but David could see the Marine Corps backbone straightening as she faced down this assault on her professionalism and character. "Miss Blackwood, I can assure you that every aspect of this evening meets the highest industry standards." "Industry standards?" Robert Blackwood interjected with a laugh that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Dear girl, we're not talking about industry standards, we're talking about social standards. There's quite a difference." David felt his hands clench involuntarily as he watched the systematic attempt to break down Patricia's confidence. This wasn't just criticism, this was psychological warfare designed to make a competent, accomplished woman doubt her own abilities and worth. Chelsea Blackwood, emboldened by her elder's behavior, decided to join the attack. "I mean, honestly, the guest list alone should have been a red flag. When you're dealing with, well, people who aren't used to these kinds of events, you have to manage expectations accordingly." "Exactly," Michael added, finally looking up from his phone with the casual cruelty of someone delivering what he considered an obvious truth. "It's like bringing a pickup truck to a Ferrari show. Same basic function but completely different class." The automobile metaphor hit David like a physical blow, not just for its casual dismissal of military service, but for its complete ignorance of reality. These people were standing in a venue worth more than most of their trust funds, criticizing people who'd earned their achievements through blood and sacrifice, while contributing nothing to society beyond their ability to spend inherited money. David found himself taking another step closer, his military training automatically assessing the tactical situation. The Blackwoods had positioned themselves in a semicircle around Patricia, using their numbers and social status to create psychological pressure. It was a classic intimidation formation, whether they realized it or not. "Look, Patricia," Vivian said, her tone shifting to fake sympathy, "I'm sure you're doing your best, but perhaps this event is simply beyond your capabilities. Maybe we should speak to whoever actually owns this place. Someone who understands what real quality looks like." The irony was so sharp it was almost painful. David bit back the urge to laugh as Vivian demanded to speak to the owner while insulting him to his face. He stood less than 10 feet away listening to these people demonstrate exactly why they deserved what was coming to them. "I understand your concerns," Patricia replied, her voice steady despite the sustained attack. "However, I'm fully authorized to manage all aspects of this event, and I stand behind the quality of service we've provided." "Authorized by whom?" Robert demanded, stepping closer with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his behavior. "Some veteran who bought this place with disability benefits and thinks that makes him qualified to run a high-end venue." David's vision actually blurred for a moment with controlled rage. The casual dismissal of disabled veterans, the assumption that military service somehow disqualified someone from business success, the complete ignorance of what it took to build something from nothing. It was breathtaking in its arrogance. The owner of Riverside Manor, Patricia, said carefully, is a highly qualified businessman who has invested considerable resources in creating one of Connecticut's premier event venues. Oh please, Chelsea laughed, the sound like breaking glass. We looked this place up online. It's all military discounts and patriotic marketing. Probably some enlisted man who got lucky with a lawsuit settlement and thinks he can play in the big league. David felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest as he watched these people tear down everything he'd built while standing in the middle of his life's work. They were so confident in their superiority, so certain that inherited wealth made them better than people who'd earned their success through merit and sacrifice. You know what I think happened here, Vivian said, warming to her theme as she sensed Patricia's growing distress. I think someone oversold their capabilities to get our business, and now they're in over their heads. It happens all the time with these aspirational business. The word aspirational dripped with condescension, reducing David's dream of creating beauty and celebrating life's important moments to some kind of desperate social climbing attempt. Marcus had begun moving toward the confrontation, his face set in the expression David remembered from their most dangerous patrols. Amanda followed behind him, tears starting to form in her eyes as she watched her family reveal their true character to her new husband and his friend. But what struck David most profoundly was the Blackwoods' absolute certainty that they were winning. Vivian's smile grew wider with each cutting remark. Robert nodded sagely as if dispensing wisdom, and the younger generation members looked on with the satisfied expressions of people watching justice being served. They had no idea they were standing in front of a man who owned everything they were criticizing, who employed the woman they were attempting to humiliate, and who had the power to end their evening with a single phone call. David took one more step forward, his decision crystallizing with military precision. These people had been given every opportunity to show basic human decency and had chosen cruelty, and they'd attacked good people who deserved respect, and they'd done it with the smug confidence of bullies who'd never faced consequences. It was time to provide those consequences. You know what I think is happening here, and Blackwood said, taking a step closer to Patricia until he was standing uncomfortably close, using his height and presence to loom over her. I think someone needs to learn their place in the social order. David watched as Robert deliberately invaded Patricia's personal space, his movements calculated to intimidate through physical presence. It was a classic power move, the kind of thing wealthy men had been doing to women they considered beneath them for generations. Patricia took a small step backward, her professional training warring with her instinct to stand her ground. Mr. Blackwood, Patricia said, her voice steady but with an edge that David recognized from their military days. I need you to step back, please. We can discuss this professionally without what? Robert interrupted, moving even closer. Without me pointing out that you're clearly in over your head, that maybe you should stick to whatever little military events you're used to instead of trying to manage real society function. David's jaw clenched as he watched Robert use his physical presence as a weapon. The man was close enough to Patricia now that she would have to crane her neck to maintain eye contact, a deliberate tactic to make her feel small and powerless. Vivian watched the exchange with obvious approval, her smile growing more predatory by the moment. Robert's absolutely right, dear. Sometimes people need to understand their limitations before they embarrass themselves further. As if emboldened by her brother-in-law's aggressive posture, Vivian stepped forward herself, creating a pincer movement that left Patricia with nowhere to retreat without appearing weak. Now I'm going to need you to make some immediate adjustments to this evening's arrangements, or I'm afraid we'll have to have a very serious conversation with whoever actually runs this establishment. David felt his combat instincts fully engage, as he recognized the tactical formation the Blackwoods had created. They were using classic intimidation techniques, surrounding their target, using height and numbers to create psychological pressure, and escalating physical presence to force submission. I've already explained, Patricia said, her voice showing the first signs of strain, that I'm fully authorized to manage all aspects of authorized by whom, Chelsea interrupted, moving to flank Patricia from the side. Some weekend warrior who thinks buying a pretty building makes him qualified to serve our kind of clientele. The phrase "our kind of clientele" dripped with such casual superiority that David felt his hands form fists at his side. These people had just revealed exactly how they saw the world, divided into their kind who deserved respect and service, and everyone else who existed to cater to their whims. Michael finally put his phone away and joined the family formation, completing their circle around Patricia. "Look, we're being nice about this, but we don't have to be. We have connections throughout this state. One word from us, and your little military charity venue won't get another decent booking." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd used family influence to destroy people before. David recognized the type spoiled children who'd learned early that daddy's money and connections could make problems disappear, and enemies fall in line. "Are you threatening me?" Patricia asked, her Marine Corps backbone finally asserting itself despite being outnumbered and outflanked. "We're explaining reality," Vivian said sweetly, reaching out to adjust an imaginary piece of lint on Patricia's shoulder, a gesture that appeared helpful but was actually another violation of personal space, another assertion of dominance. "Sometimes people need help understanding how things really work." David watched as Vivian's touch made Patricia flinch almost imperceptibly. The gesture was designed to be demeaning, the way someone might adjust a child's clothing or pet a subordinate. It reduced Patricia from a professional equal to something closer to hired help who needed management. "The reality," Robert added, now standing close enough that Patricia had to take another step back to maintain any personal space, "is that we're the customers here, and the customer is always right, especially customers with our resources and connection." The Blackwoods had now formed a complete circle around Patricia, their combined presence creating a wall of implied threat. David could see the calculation in their movements. They weren't quite touching her, weren't quite making overt threats, but they were using every psychological and physical intimidation tactic short of actual assault. Staff Sergeant Williams had noticed the confrontation and was moving closer, his own military instincts recognizing a developing situation. Other veterans from Marcus's side were beginning to take notice as well, their protective instincts engaging as they saw one of their own being surrounded and threatened. "I think," Vivian said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum, "that you need to call your boss right now and get someone down here who actually understands how to handle clients of our caliber." "My boss," Patricia repeated, her eyes flickering toward David's position near the wall. For just a moment her professional mask slipped, and David could see the question in her expression. How much longer should she endure this before calling for back? "Yes, dear," Robert said condescendingly. "Your boss, the owner, the person who actually makes decisions around here, because clearly you're not qualified to handle this level of responsibility." David found himself taking another step forward, his decision crystallizing with military precision. The Blackwoods had crossed every line that civilized people respected. They'd moved from verbal abuse to physical intimidation, from criticism to threats, from ignorance to deliberate cruelty. They were now surrounding and threatening a woman who'd served her country with honor, in a venue owned by a man they'd dismissed as unworthy of their respect. They were using their wealth and social position as weapons against people who'd earned their status through sacrifice and merit. Marcus had begun moving through the crowd toward the confrontation, his face set in the expression David remembered from their most dangerous missions. Amanda followed close behind, tears streaming down her face, as she watched her family transform her wedding into a battlefield. But what sealed David's decision was the look of triumph on Vivian Blackwood's face, as she watched Patricia struggle to maintain her composure under their coordinated assault. These people were enjoying themselves. They were taking pleasure in the systematic humiliation of a good person who couldn't fight back without risking her professional reputation. David straightened to his full height and began walking directly toward the circle of Blackwoods, his movement carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded troops in combat zones. The time for observation was over. It was time to introduce the Blackwood family to the concept of consequences. The grand ballroom, which had felt spacious and elegant just minutes before, now seemed to contract around the developing confrontation, like a pressure cooker reaching its breaking point. The Blackwood family had effectively cornered Patricia against the wall near the entrance, cutting off her escape routes while other guests found themselves trapped as unwilling witnesses to the escalating drama. David noted with tactical precision how the room's layout had turned against Patricia, the elegant round tables, so perfectly arranged for conversation and photography, now created obstacles that prevented easy movement. The Blackwoods had positioned themselves between Patricia and the main dining area, while the heavy oak doors to the foyer remained blocked by curious guests who'd gathered to watch the spectacle. "I'm done being patient with you," Vivian announced, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. "You're going to call your boss right now, in front of everyone, and explain why you're not qualified to handle a Blackwood family event." Robert pulled out his phone with theatrical flourish, his movements designed to draw attention from every corner of the room. "Here, use my phone. I'm sure whoever runs this place will be very interested to hear how their employee has been treating paying customers." The humiliation was deliberate and public, designed not just to break Patricia but to establish the Blackwood family's dominance in front of an audience. David watched as other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, trapped between their desire to intervene and their uncertainty about getting involved in what appeared to be a private business dispute. Chelsea stepped closer to Patricia, her movement cutting off the last viable exit route toward the kitchen service doors. "Come on. Don't be shy. Make the call. Let's see who actually runs this place, and whether they agree with your approach to customer service." Michael positioned himself near the entrance to block any retreat toward the foyer, completing their tactical encirclement. "This is really quite simple," he said with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequence. "Either you admit you're in over your head, or we make some phone calls of our own that will end this little business venture permanently." David felt the familiar calm that came over him in combat situations. Time seemed to slow down as he assessed the tactical situation with military precision. The Blackwoods had made a critical error in their positioning. By cornering Patricia so publicly, they'd created a situation where any intervention would be witnessed by the entire wedding party, making their humiliation complete and undeniable. Staff Sergeant Williams had moved closer, his own military instincts recognizing a developing crisis. Behind him, Corporal Jackson and Lieutenant Morrison were also advancing, their movements coordinated with the unconscious precision of men who'd worked together in dangerous situations. The military contingent was beginning to react to the threat against one of their own, but it was Marcus who broke first. David watched his friend push through the gathered crowd with barely controlled fury, his dress blue uniform making his approach impossible to ignore. "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "You're going to step away from Patricia right now." Vivian turned toward Marcus with the dismissive smile of someone who'd never been challenged by help. "Oh, Marcus, dear. This doesn't concern you. We're simply trying to get proper service for your wedding. Surely you want everything to be perfect for Amanda." "What I want," Marcus replied, his voice deadly quiet, "is for you to stop threatening my friend and fellow Marine. Patricia Williams is one of the finest officers I've ever served with, and she deserves your respect, not your abuse." Robert laughed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings with harsh arrogance. "Oh please, military credentials don't mean anything in the real world. This isn't some desert outpost. This is Connecticut high society." The insult to military service in general, and Patricia's service specifically, hit the room like a physical blow. David saw Staff Sergeant Williams's face darken with controlled anger, watched as other veterans throughout the ballroom began to stand up from their tables. Amanda had reached the confrontation now, tears streaming down her face as she watched her family destroy her wedding day. "Mother, please stop this. You're embarrassing everyone. Patricia has done a beautiful job. Amanda, you're too naive for your own good," Vivian snapped, her facade of maternal concern cracking to reveal the entitled rage beneath. "Someone needs to maintain standards when others won't." Chelsea pointed an accusatory finger at Patricia, her voice rising with the excitement of someone delivering what she considered a knockout blow. "Look at her. She can't even defend herself properly. What kind of manager can't handle a simple customer complaint?" David realized that the Blackwoods had made their fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed that their wealth and social position would intimidate everyone in the room into compliance or silence. They hadn't considered that they were surrounded by people who'd faced real danger and overcome genuine adversity. The ballroom had become a pressure cooker, with nowhere for the tension to escape. Wedding guests sat frozen at their tables, servers huddled uncertainly near the kitchen doors, and the photographer continued capturing what would become the most memorable and damaging images of the evening. Patricia stood at the center of it all, surrounded and outnumbered but refusing to break under the sustained assault. David could see the Marine Corps steel in her spine, the same backbone that had carried her through deployment after deployment. She wasn't going to beg or apologize or call for help. She was going to stand her ground no matter what it cost her. "You know what I think," Robert said, moving even closer to Patricia, until he was close enough to reach out and touch her. "I think you need to learn some respect for your better." That phrase, "your betters," hit David like a lightning bolt. These people actually believed they were superior human beings, based on nothing more than inherited wealth and social position. They thought their money made them better than people who'd sacrificed for others, built something from nothing, and earned their success through merit and service. David began walking forward with the measured pace of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. The Blackwoods had trapped Patricia in their circle of intimidation, but they'd also trapped themselves in a room full of people who were about to discover exactly who they'd been insulting for the past hour. As he approached the confrontation, David felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The Blackwood family was about to learn the difference between inherited privilege and earned authority. They were about to discover what happened when unearned arrogance met real power. And they were about to find out that sometimes the quiet man in the cheap suit owns everything you're standing on. With Patricia now completely trapped and surrounded, Vivian Blackwood launched into what could only be described as a coordinated campaign of psychological destruction. Her voice took on the measured cadence of someone delivering a practiced performance, each word calculated for maximum humiliation. "You know what, everyone?" Vivian announced, turning slightly to address the captive audience of wedding guests who had no choice but to witness the spectacle. "I think this is a perfect teachable moment about the importance of hiring qualified professionals for important events." David watched in mounting fury as Vivian transformed Patricia's public humiliation into a lecture for the entire ballroom. The cruelty was breathtaking, using Patricia as a cautionary tale while the woman stood trapped and defenseless just feet away. Robert nodded sagely, playing his part in the coordinated assault. "Absolutely right, Vivian. You see, when you compromise on quality to save money, this is what happens. Military discounts might sound charitable, but they usually come with military-level service, functional perhaps, but hardly sophisticated." The casual dismissal of military service excellence made David's jaw clench so hard he could hear his teeth grinding. These people were standing in a venue that represented the pinnacle of restoration craftsmanship and event management, criticizing the very people who'd made it possible. Chelsea stepped up to deliver her contribution to the systematic takedown, her voice carrying the particular smugness of someone who'd never earned anything through merit. "I mean, look at tonight. The flowers are adequate, the catering is functional, but where's the refinement? Where's the attention to detail that separates a real event from a military mess hall gathering?" David's eyes swept the ballroom, every flower arrangement hand-selected by Connecticut's premier florist, every place setting positioned with geometric precision, every lighting element calibrated to create the perfect ambiance. The adequate arrangements had cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the functional catering was being provided by one of New England's most exclusive restaurants. Michael joined the chorus with the bored efficiency of someone who'd participated in family destruction campaigns before. "The problem is that some people just don't understand the difference between good enough and actually good. They think because they can follow a checklist, they can manage sophisticated events." Patricia stood at the center of their circle, her face pale but her spine straight as she endured the systematic demolition of her professional reputation. David could see the cost of maintaining her composure, the slight tremor in her hands, the tightness around her eyes, the way she held herself perfectly still to avoid showing weakness to these predators. "And the guest list," Vivian continued, warming to her theme as she gestured dismissively toward Marcus's military friends. "Well, that speaks for itself, doesn't it? When you cater to certain demographics, you inevitably compromise the overall quality of the experience." Staff Sergeant Williams had heard enough. The decorated veteran rose from his seat with the controlled movement of someone who'd spent decades maintaining discipline under impossible circumstances. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "I think you need to stop right there." Vivian turned toward him, with the kind of smile she might give to a particularly slow child. "Oh, another one of Marcus's military friends wants to defend the honor of their little club. Tell me, Sergeant, do you really think you understand what constitutes appropriate behavior at a sophisticated social gathering?" The insult was designed to provoke exactly the kind of response that would justify calling security or involving law enforcement. David recognized the tactic: push until someone snaps, then claim victim status while destroying their reputation and livelihood. But Staff Sergeant Williams had faced down enemy fire in 3 different wars. He wasn't about to be rattled by a privileged socialite with delusions of superiority. "Ma'am," he repeated with military precision, "I understand appropriate behavior just fine. What I'm seeing here isn't." Robert laughed, the sound harsh and mocking in the elegant space. "Oh, this is rich. Now we're getting etiquette lessons from enlisted men. What's next? Wine recommendations from the cafeteria staff." Lieutenant Morrison stood up from his table, his movement causing a ripple effect as other military guests began rising in solidarity. "Actually," he said with the quiet authority of someone who'd led troops through combat zones, "I think we understand honor and respect better than most people in this room." "Honor and respect," Chelsea repeated mockingly. Is that what they call it when you can't afford proper venues and have to rely on charity discounts?" The systematic nature of their attack was becoming clear. Each family member had a role to play in the complete destruction of Patricia's credibility and the humiliation of the military guest. They moved like a pack of predators, coordinating their assault to ensure maximum psychological damage. "You know what I find most disappointing," Vivian said, her voice taking on a tone of false sadness, "is that Amanda had to settle for this level of service because of her choice in groom. If she'd married someone from our social circle, she could have had a proper wedding at a proper venue with proper staff." That attack on Marcus, delivered in front of his new wife and his military brothers, crossed a line that made David's vision blur with controlled rage. These people weren't just attacking Patricia anymore, they were attacking the very foundation of Marcus and Amanda's marriage. Amanda sobbed openly now, her wedding day completely destroyed by her family's cruelty. "Mother, please stop, you're ruining everything. Marcus is a good man, and Patricia has done a beautiful job." "Amanda, darling," Vivian said with patronizing patience, "you're young and romantic, but someone needs to maintain standards. When you allow people to get above their station, this is what happens: chaos, confusion, and disappointment." David realized he was witnessing something beyond simple snobbery or even racism. This was systematic dehumanization, the deliberate reduction of accomplished, honorable people to subhuman status based solely on class prejudice and inherited privilege. The Blackwoods had revealed themselves to be exactly the kind of people David had spent his military career protecting. Americans who enjoyed the freedoms that military sacrifice provided while despising the very people who'd paid the price for those freedoms. As David continued his measured approach toward the confrontation, he felt a cold satisfaction settling in his chest. These people had just demonstrated why they deserved not just correction, but complete and total humiliation. They were about to learn that sometimes the person you're systematically destroying owns everything you're standing on. The systematic campaign of humiliation took a darker turn as Vivian Blackwood's voice grew more venomous, her attacks becoming deeply personal and targeted at the core values that defined Patricia and the military community. "You know what really bothers me about people like you, Patricia," Vivian said, stepping even closer until she was close enough to see the flecks of gold in Patricia's brown eyes. "You think that putting on a uniform somehow makes you special, that it entitles you to respect you haven't actually earned." David felt his hands clench into fists as he watched Vivian attack the very foundation of military service, the idea that sacrifice and dedication to something greater than oneself created honor and earned respect. This wasn't just ignorance anymore. This was deliberate assault on the values that held society together. Robert nodded with the satisfaction of someone delivering a long overdue truth. "Exactly. Military service is just a job after all, a government job, with guaranteed benefits and early retirement. It's not like you're building businesses or creating wealth or contributing anything meaningful to society." The casual dismissal of military sacrifice hit every veteran in the room like a physical blow. David watched Lieutenant Morrison's face go white with controlled fury, saw Staff Sergeant Williams's hands shake slightly as he processed the insult to every soldier who'd ever bled for their country. And let's be honest about what military service really is, Chelsea added with the cruel precision of someone who'd never risked anything for anyone. It's where people go when they can't make it in the real world, when they need the government to provide structure because they can't create success on their own. David's vision blurred as he listened to these people who'd inherited everything they had. Dismiss military service as a failure of personal achievement. They were standing in a venue built by a veteran, being served by staff managed by a veteran, celebrating a wedding only possible because veterans had protected their freedom to gather safely. Michael looked up from his phone long enough to deliver his own cutting observation. The whole hero narrative is really just clever marketing, isn't it? Make people feel guilty for questioning anything military-related by wrapping it in flags and patriotic music, but at the end of the day you're just government employees with good people. Patricia's composure finally cracked slightly, a barely perceptible tremor in her voice as she spoke. I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan, lost friends to IEDs and sniper fire, and spent 15 years protecting the freedoms that allow you to speak this way. If you think that's just marketing, oh, spare us the sob story, Vivian interrupted with a dismissive wave. Everyone has a hard luck story, dear. The difference is that some of us don't use our difficulties as an excuse to demand special treatment from society. The cruelty was breathtaking. David watched Vivian reduce Patricia's service and sacrifice to a sob story and excuse for special treatment. These people saw military service, the willingness to die for others, as somehow less worthy than their inherited comfort. And frankly, Robert added, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child, the whole military worship thing has gotten out of hand in this country. Just because someone signs up doesn't make them better than people who choose more productive paths, Staff Sergeant Williams repeated slowly, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet of a man approaching his breaking point. Like what, exactly? Like inheriting daddy's money and calling it success? Robert's face flushed red at the direct challenge to his unearned status. I built my restaurant empire through hard work and business acumen, something you military types wouldn't understand. You're used to having everything handed to you by the government. The accusation that military personnel had things handed to them by people who'd literally inherited their wealth was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. David watched as more veterans throughout the ballroom began standing, their faces showing the kind of controlled anger that came from years of discipline and training. Chelsea decided to escalate the personal attacks further, her voice rising with excitement as she sensed weakness. And what about all the military benefits, free healthcare, education, housing allowances? You're basically welfare recipients with better uniforms. Lieutenant Morrison had heard enough. Ma'am, he said with the kind of icy professionalism that preceded violent action in combat zones, I'd suggest you stop talking before you say something you'll truly regret. Are you threatening me? Chelsea gasped with theatrical horror. Did everyone hear? This military person just threatened a civilian at a private event. The attempted manipulation was transparent, provoke a response, then claim victim status. But Vivian saw an opportunity to deliver what she clearly considered the killing blow to Patricia's dignity and the military community's standing. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Vivian announced to the entire ballroom, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. Military types think they can intimidate civilians with their aggressive behavior. They're trained to be violent, and they bring that violence into civilized society. The accusation that veterans were inherently violent and dangerous to civilians was the most poisonous lie possible. David watched Patricia's face go pale as she realized the trap. Any response would be used as evidence of military aggression, while silence would be taken as admission of guilt. You want to know what I really think? Robert said, emboldened by his wife's tactical success. I think Patricia here is exactly the kind of person who gives veterans a bad name, probably couldn't cut it in the real military, so now she's playing dress-up as a business manager and failing at that too. The attack on Patricia's military credentials and professional competence while she stood surrounded and defenseless was designed to break her completely. David could see the cost of maintaining her composure, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she held herself perfectly still to avoid showing any reaction that could be twisted against her. Face it, dear, Vivian said with false sympathy,
moving close enough to Patricia that her voice became almost intimate, almost caring. "You're in over your head here. This isn't some military base where you can bark orders and expect compliance. This is the real world, where competence matters more than costume jewelry ribbons." The dismissal of military decorations as costume jewelry was the final insult to every sacrifice made by every veteran in the room. David could feel the collective anger of the military community reaching a breaking point, could sense the moment when discipline and restraint would give way to protective fury. But what sealed his own decision was watching Patricia, a woman who'd served her country with honor, managed world-class events with distinction and faced down enemy fire without flinching, stand there, taking abuse from people whose greatest challenge in life had been choosing which trust fund to access. David had seen enough. These people had revealed themselves to be exactly what he'd suspected: parasites, who enjoyed the benefits of freedom while despising the people who'd paid for it. They'd attacked everything he held sacred, insulted everyone he respected, and degraded the values that made civilization possible. As he continued his measured approach toward the confrontation, David felt the cold satisfaction of someone about to deliver justice that had been a long time coming.
The ballroom had fallen into an eerie silence. The kind of quiet that preceded explosions in combat zones. David could feel the collective rage of the military community reaching a critical mass. But what happened next crossed a line so sacred that it transformed controlled anger into something far more dangerous. Vivian Blackwood, drunk on her own perceived power and completely oblivious to the gathering storm around her, decided to deliver what she clearly believed would be the killing blow. She reached out with her perfectly manicured hand and deliberately touched the small Marine Corps pin on Patricia's jacket lapel, the same pin David had seen Patricia wear to every formal event. A symbol of her service and sacrifice. "You know what this little badge really represents," Vivian said, her fingers actually gripping the pin as if she might tear it off. "It represents the participation trophy generation. Everyone gets a medal just for showing up, even if they spent their whole deployment sitting safely on some base, filing paperwork and pretending to be warriors." The physical contact with Patricia's service pin was like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. David watched every veteran in the ballroom go rigid with fury as Vivian violated one of the most sacred boundaries in military culture, touching another service member's decorations without permission. But Vivian wasn't finished. As she held Patricia's pin between her fingers, she continued her assault with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never understood the concept of sacrifice. "I bet you never even saw real combat, did you, dear? Probably spent your tours in some air-conditioned office, pushing papers and living off the heroism of actual soldiers." David's vision went white-hot as he watched Vivian hold Patricia's symbol of service while dismissing her 3 combat tours and the friends she'd lost. The casual assumption that a female Marine couldn't have seen real action revealed a level of ignorance so profound it was almost beyond comprehension. Patricia's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the deadly quiet of someone who'd reached the end of their endurance. "Ma'am, I need you to remove your hand from my uniform, now." "Or what?" Vivian laughed, actually twisting the pin slightly as if testing its attachment. "What are you going to do, have one of your military boyfriends intimidate me? Prove my point about veterans being unable to handle civilized disagreement." The deliberate physical manipulation of Patricia's service pin while questioning her combat experience and suggesting inappropriate relationships with her fellow Marines was a triple violation that made David's hands shake with controlled fury. But it was Robert Blackwood's next comment that crossed the final unforgivable line. "You want to know what I really think about your precious military service?" Robert said, stepping closer to Patricia until he was close enough to see his reflection in her eyes. "I think most of you sign up because you're too stupid or too poor to make it in the real world. The military is where society dumps its failures and calls them heroes to make everyone feel better." The systematic dehumanization of military service was breathtaking in its cruelty. But Robert wasn't finished. He gestured toward Marcus, who stood frozen with rage at the head table, still in his dress blue uniform. "Look at Marcus over there," Robert continued with casual viciousness. "Perfect example. Probably came from some trailer park, couldn't afford college, So he signed up to play soldier for a few years and now expects the world to treat him like nobility because he followed orders in some sandbox. Amanda's anguished cry cut through the ballroom like a knife. Stop it. Please stop it. Marcus is a hero. He saved lives. He's a welfare recipient with a uniform. Vivian interrupted sharply, finally releasing Patricia's pin but leaving her fingers hovering inches from Patricia's chest in a gesture of continued intimidation. And now he's trapped our Amanda in a marriage beneath her station because she was too naive to see through the military mythology. The attack on Marcus's character, his background and his worthiness as Amanda's husband, while he stood in his dress uniform representing everything honorable about military service, was the final straw for everyone in the room. David watched Staff Sergeant Williams begin moving toward the confrontation with the measured pace of someone preparing for combat. But it was Chelsea who delivered the blow that shattered every last restraint in the room. Looking directly at the memorial table that Amanda had set up to honor fallen veterans, including photos of 3 Marines who hadn't made it home from David and Marcus's deployment, she laughed with genuine amusement. "Oh, how touching," she said, pointing at the memorial display with mock sentimentality, the dead soldier shrine. "Tell me how many of those boys were actually heroes and how many just made poor life choices that got them killed." The memorial table held photos of Corporal Jake Morrison, who died shielding civilians from a suicide bomber, Sergeant Mike Chen, who'd been killed while carrying wounded children to safety, and Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, who'd stepped on an IED while clearing a path for his squad. Each man had died saving others, and Chelsea had just dismissed their ultimate sacrifice as poor life choices. David felt something cold and final settle in his chest as he watched Chelsea mock the photographs of his fallen brother. The woman who'd never risked anything for anyone, who'd never faced any danger more serious than choosing which charity luncheon to attend, had just spat on the graves of genuine heroes. The silence that followed Chelsea's comment was unlike anything David had ever experienced. It was the silence of a funeral, the silence of a cemetery, the silence that followed when something sacred had been destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. Patricia stood perfectly still, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the photos of the fallen Marine. Marcus had gone pale as death, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every veteran in the room looked like they were preparing for war, their faces showing the kind of controlled fury that preceded decisive action. But it was the look of triumph on Vivian Blackwood's face that sealed their fate. She actually smiled as she surveyed the devastation she'd created, clearly believing she'd won some kind of victory by reducing decorated veterans to tears and breaking the spirit of people who'd served their country with honor. David realized he was looking at people who didn't just lack honor, they were actively opposed to it. They didn't just fail to understand sacrifice, they despised it. They weren't just ignorant about military service, they were hostile to the very concept that some things were worth fighting and dying for. As David took his final steps toward the confrontation, he felt a sense of absolute clarity. These people had forfeited any claim to civility, respect, or mercy. They had revealed themselves to be exactly the kind of evil that good people spend their lives fighting against. The Blackwood family was about to learn what happened when parasites attacked the very immune system that kept society healthy. They were about to discover that sometimes justice came with compound interest, and the bill for their cruelty was about to come due in the silence that followed Chelsea's desecration of the memorial table stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. In that moment of absolute stillness, David Chen stepped forward from the shadows where he'd been observing, his movement cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. His footsteps echoed clearly across the marble floor, as he walked with the measured precision of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward him, the quiet man in the modest suit who'd been dismissed and insulted for the past hour while standing in his own venue. "Excuse me," David said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. The tone was calm, professional, almost conversational, but underneath it was something that made every person with military training straighten to attention. Vivian Blackwood turned toward him with the irritated expression of someone being interrupted during a moment of triumph. "I'm sorry, but this is a private family matter. I don't know who you are, but I know exactly who I am," David interrupted quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced down enemies in combat zones. "The question is whether you know who you are, and whether you understand what you've just done." Robert Blackwood laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive in the elegant space. "Oh great. Another one of Marcus's military friends wants to play hero. Look, buddy, this doesn't concern you. We're having a conversation with the staff about service quality." David's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made Staff Sergeant Williams and the other veterans pause in their advance. They recognized command presence when they saw it, the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself with volume or posturing. "Service quality," David repeated, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "That's what you call physically assaulting my manager while insulting fallen heroes." "Your manager?" Chelsea laughed, the sound brittle and nervous. "What are you, some kind of supervisor?" "Look, we're paying customers here and we have standards." "Standards," David said, taking another step forward. His movement was unhurried, controlled, but there was something in it that made the Blackwood family unconsciously step back. "Let me tell you about standard." He gestured toward Patricia, who stood with tears still streaming down her face, her Marine Corps pin slightly askew from Vivian's violation. "This woman served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. She's been shot at, mortared, and has saved more lives than you'll ever know. She manages events with military precision, because she learned organization under circumstances where mistakes got people killed." Vivian opened her mouth to interrupt, but David's quiet intensity stopped her cold. "She's also managed to plan and execute what you've described as a flawless evening while you've spent the past hour systematically attacking her character, her service, and her professionalism," David continued. "If that's not meeting standards, I'd like to understand what your definition of excellence actually is." Robert stepped forward aggressively, trying to use his height to intimidate David the same way he'd attempted with Patricia. "Look, whoever you are, you need to understand that the Blackwood family has certain expectations." "The Blackwood family," David said, his voice dropping to the deadly quiet tone that combat veterans recognized as the calm before decisive action, "has spent the evening proving that inherited money can't buy class, dignity, or basic human decency." The insult hit Robert like a physical blow, his face flushing red with rage. "How dare you? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? We have connections throughout this state. One phone call from us can destroy careers, ruin businesses." "Threats," David said simply, his composure never wavering. "When reason fails, when decency fails, when basic human courtesy fails, you resort to threats. It's exactly what I expect." Michael finally looked up from his phone, sensing that something had shifted in the room's dynamic. "Look, friend, I don't know what your connection to this place is, but you're way out of line here. We're discussing legitimate concerns with the venue management." "Legitimate concerns," David repeated, his gaze shifting to the memorial table where photos of his fallen brothers still sat in their places of honor. "You mean like mocking the sacrifice of Marines who died saving other people's lives, like calling their deaths poor life choices?" The quiet fury in David's voice made Chelsea take an involuntary step backward. For the first time that evening, she seemed to realize that her casual cruelty might have consequences. "I'm going to give you one opportunity," David said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "One chance to salvage what's left of your dignity and your daughter's wedding day." He looked each member of the Blackwood family in the eye, his gaze lingering on Vivian's face. "You're going to apologize, to Patricia, to every veteran in this room, to your daughter and her husband, and to the memory of the Marines whose sacrifice you just mocked." "Apologize?" Vivian gasped, her voice rising with indignation. "We're not apologizing to anyone. We're paying customers, and we demand." "You demand," David said quietly, taking one final step forward until he stood just outside their circle of intimidation. "That's been the theme of the evening, hasn't it? You demand respect you haven't earned. You demand service from people you consider beneath you. You demand the right to humiliate and degrade anyone who doesn't meet your arbitrary standards." His voice never rose above conversational level, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Here's what I demand: basic human decency. Respect for people who've served their country, and an end to your systematic cruelty toward people who've done nothing but try to give you a perfect evening. Robert stepped even closer, his face twisted with rage. And what if we refuse? What are you going to do about it? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and completely out of your league here. We own people like you. David's smile was slight, cold, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who knew how to read it. Own people like me, he repeated softly. That's interesting. Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, exactly what do you think you own? The question hung in the air like a blade, its meaning unclear but somehow ominous. Marcus had begun moving closer, recognizing something in David's voice that he remembered from their most dangerous moments overseas. Patricia watched with growing understanding, her professional instincts finally recognizing the authority that David had kept carefully hidden all evening. I own 3 successful restaurants, Robert blustered, trying to maintain his momentum of intimidation. I have connections throughout Connecticut's business community. I know judges, politicians, business leaders. Connections, David said, his voice carrying a note of genuine amusement. How interesting. And you think those connections give you the right to abuse people with impunity? Vivian sensed that something fundamental had shifted, but her arrogance wouldn't let her acknowledge it. Look, whoever you are, you clearly don't understand how the real world works. Money talks, and people like us, people like you, David interrupted, his quiet voice cutting through her bluster like a sword through silk, are about to learn that sometimes the person you're threatening owns everything you're standing on. The words hung in the air with the weight of revelation, but their full meaning hadn't quite penetrated the Blackwood family's consciousness. They still saw a modestly dressed man making empty threats, not understanding that they were about to face consequences that would reshape their understanding of power, privilege, and justice. Robert Blackwood's face twisted with contempt as he stepped even closer to David, his voice dripping with the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. You think you can threaten us? Do you have any idea what you're dealing with? We are Connecticut society. We own this state, and we can destroy anyone who crosses us. Own, David repeated softly, his calm seeming almost supernatural in contrast to Robert's rage. That's a fascinating word choice. He pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness, his movements carrying the precision of someone who'd made countless life or death decisions under pressure. Patricia, he said, never taking his eyes off the Blackwood family, would you please join me for a moment? Patricia wiped her tears and walked toward David with growing understanding, her military bearing returning as she recognized the authority she'd been trained to respect. The ballroom watched in absolute silence as she stood beside the man they'd all dismissed as an unimportant guest. Ladies and gentlemen, David said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom, I think it's time for some introductions. My name is David Chen, and I'm the owner of Riverside Manor. The words hit the ballroom like a thunderbolt. Gasps echoed off the vaulted ceilings as the full implications crashed over the wedding guests. The quiet man in the modest suit, the one they'd called out of place, cheap and unworthy, owned the $2 million venue they'd been celebrating. Vivian Blackwood's face went white as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The man she'd been insulting, whose military service she'd mocked, whose manager she'd physically assaulted, owned everything she was standing on. Impossible, Robert stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. You're lying. You're just some construction worker. I am a construction worker, David said with quiet pride. I work with Coleman Brothers Construction during the day because I believe in earning an honest living and staying connected to the people who built this country with their hands. But I also happen to own this manor along with several other properties throughout Connecticut. He gestured toward Patricia with obvious respect. And this woman you've been systematically humiliating? She's not just my manager. She's a former Marine Corps logistics officer who earned her MBA from Yale while serving her country. She runs operations here with the same precision she used to coordinate supply lines in combat zones. Chelsea's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no sound emerging as her worldview collapsed around her. The military discount you've been mocking, David continued, his voice gaining strength. It's something I offer because I understand the value of service over selfishness, sacrifice over self-interest. Marcus received that discount not because he needed charity, but because he earned it by carrying me to safety when an IED nearly killed me in Ramadi. Marcus stood straighter, tears streaming down his face,
as his friend publicly honored their brotherhood and his sacrifice. And those dead soldiers whose sacrifice your daughter just mocked. David's voice carried a dangerous edge as he looked directly at Chelsea. Those were my brother. Corporal Morrison died shielding a school full of children from a suicide bomber. Sergeant Chen carried wounded civilians to safety before a sniper's bullet found him. Private Rodriguez triggered an IED while clearing a path so his squad could reach wounded Marines. The silence was deafening as David's words sank in. Chelsea had mocked genuine heroes, while standing in a venue built by the very sacrifices she'd dismissed. So when you ask what I own, David said, turning back to Robert with cold precision, I own this man. I own the catering company providing your food. I own the transportation company that brought you here, and I own the security firm that's about to escort you out. As if summoned by his words, Patricia spoke quietly into her radio. Within moments, professional security personnel appeared at the ballroom entrances, not aggressive or threatening, but clearly present and ready. You can't do this, Vivian shrieked, her composure finally cracking completely. We have a contract. We paid for this venue. You had a contract, David corrected calmly, but contracts include behavioral clauses. When you physically assaulted my manager, threatened my staff, and showed systematic disrespect for my other guests, you violated those terms. He pulled out a folder from his jacket, documents he'd retrieved from Patricia's office during his walk across the ballroom. Your deposit will be refunded in full. The wedding will continue but without your presence. Amanda and Marcus deserve to celebrate their love without being subjected to your toxicity. Amanda stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. David, I'm so sorry. I had no idea they would. Amanda, David said gently, his voice softening with genuine kindness. You have nothing to apologize for. You and Marcus are good people who deserve happiness. Your family's choices are not your responsibility. He turned to address the entire ballroom, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak about honor and character. Everyone here tonight has witnessed something important. You've seen the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect, between demanding service and deserving it. Some people believe their money makes them better than others, but money is just a tool. It's how you use it that defines your character. David's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of veterans, civilians, young and old alike. Real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or social status. It's measured in the lives you've touched, the sacrifices you've made for others, and the respect you've earned through your actions. These veterans risked everything so that people like the Blackwoods could enjoy the freedom to gather safely, to speak freely, and to pursue happiness. His voice grew stronger, carrying the conviction of someone who'd seen the best and worst of humanity. But with that freedom comes responsibility. The responsibility to treat others with dignity, to honor those who've served, and to understand that true class has nothing to do with your bloodline and everything to do with your character. Robert made one last desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. You can't humiliate us like this. Do you know who we are? We have connections. I know exactly who you are, David said with finality. You're people who mistake inherited money for personal worth, who confuse social position with moral authority, and who've forgotten that respect is earned, not inherited. He nodded to the security team, who began moving forward with professional courtesy. The Blackwood family is no longer welcome at any of my properties. Their behavior tonight has demonstrated that they lack the basic character necessary to be part of civilized society. As security began escorting the Blackwood family toward the exits, Vivian turned back with one final shriek of indignation. This isn't over. We'll sue. We'll destroy your business. Will, ma'am, said the lead security officer with military precision. You're trespassing on private property. Please come with us voluntarily, or we'll be forced to involve law enforcement. The ballroom watched in stunned silence as the family who'd dominated the evening through intimidation and cruelty were led away like common criminals, their entitled protests echoing pathetically off the walls they'd never again be allowed to enter. As the doors closed behind them, David turned to address his remaining guests, the veterans, the families, the good people who'd been forced to witness the systematic humiliation of American heroes. Now, he said with a warm smile that transformed his entire demeanor, let's celebrate what really matters. Marcus and Amanda, you have a marriage to begin, friends to honor, and a future to build together. The ballroom erupted in applause, not polite society clapping but the genuine celebration of people who'd watched justice served and honor defended. Veterans embraced, families cheered, and for the first time all evening, the joy that should have defined a wedding filled the magnificent space. Patricia approached David with tears in her eyes. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." "Patricia," David said, placing a respectful hand on her shoulder, "you served our country with honor, and you run my business with excellence. I should be thanking you." As the evening continued, now filled with genuine laughter, heartfelt toasts, and the celebration of love triumphing over hate, David stood quietly near the memorial table, looking at the photos of his fallen brothers. Staff Sergeant Williams joined him, raising his glass in silent salute. "They would have been proud of tonight, sir. Justice served, honor defended." David nodded, understanding that sometimes the greatest tribute to fallen heroes was ensuring their sacrifices weren't mocked or forgotten by those who'd never understood the price of freedom. The wedding continued into the night, a celebration not just of Marcus and Amanda's love, but of the values that made such love possible: honor, sacrifice, respect, and the understanding that true nobility comes not from what you inherit, but from what you choose to do for others. And in a venue built by military sacrifice and dedicated to celebrating life's most important moments, David Chen, the quiet man in the modest suit, had delivered the most important lesson of all: character cannot be bought, respect must be earned, and sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected sources. The Blackwood family would never again be welcome in the circles they'd once dominated, but more importantly, everyone who witnessed that evening would remember that true power lies not in inherited wealth or social position, but in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and wearing a cheap suit.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.